Putin, having been re-elected, trying to put yourself into the mind of these sort of guys is not easy, clearly. But you can imagine that he will now, having been re-elected, make these changes. He wants to see significant success this year. And we know that he can only be able to bring that about by ramping up production, getting all the war production levels and so forth. But also he has got to mobilize some more people, particularly if he still has the intent of trying to secure the whole of Ukraine. If in his own mind, what he's thinking is, let's grab a little bit more territory, do this buffer zone that we were talking about before, or not, and not push on, beyond that, and then just sit there and say to Zelensky, you need to negotiate, and come from a position that I'm not going to give up the eastern provinces, I'm not going to give up Crimea, you're not in a position of retaking that territory, and therefore let's negotiate. There are rumors that Zelensky and Putin might even meet one another fairly soon. I mean, I picked that up last week and had a conversation actually only yesterday. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but there are some rumors. So, one has to try and imagine in Putin's mind, what is he trying to achieve here? I'm not convinced that he really believes anymore that he can secure the whole of Ukraine, but I'm pretty sure that he will not give up on what he's got, and he may well try and achieve a bit more through some sort of, opening up this counteroffensive, or indeed putting more pressure on in the south and east, where the pressure hasn't gone away. And Ukraine is struggling, going back to mobilization, Ukraine is struggling to mobilize people. I mean, a lot of young people are not signing up, and quite a lot have left. And they are, there's a lot of conversation going on in Ukraine about what to do about this. So I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that Putin wants to increase the pressure, ramp up production, put these new people in place, and then, as you say, mobilize more people in order to be able to maintain the pressure, if not increase it.
It's fascinating what you said there about the potential, and I appreciate it is only speculation, but the potential for Putin and Zelensky to meet. How would that even work in practice? I mean, where would they meet, for instance?
Somewhere that hopefully you and I would not know, nor anybody else in the media. It has to be done, quietly behind the scenes. And it has to be done out of the spotlight of the media and the world's eyes. So, where would it be? Well, there are options. I mean, clearly, some of the Nordic countries have traditionally hosted peace talks. I don't know is the honest answer, but it would have to be. There would obviously be preliminary meetings having to go on, and conversations being had. But that happens in all of these conflicts. I mean, it's like Israel-Gaza. There's lots of conversations going on, and you have officials at certain levels that get involved at certain stages before you ramp it up to your foreign ministers and so on, until you then have the heads of state meetings. So there's work to be done. I can't see it being done in Russia or Ukraine. So, Belarus potentially, I suppose, but maybe somewhere else, in the region. I can't see both of them flying off, to be honest, long distances. I suspect it will have to be on the ground in the neighborhood, in inverted commas. But I stress it's only speculation. I had picked it up. I picked it up from a couple of sources. So I'm not saying it's not happening. It's certainly possible. It may not be probable at this stage, but it is potentially the case.
And if we look at what Ukraine can hope to achieve realistically in the next few months, I mean, it's interesting, despite the Russian advances in the northeast, Ukraine continued to have some success striking targets within Russian territory, and indeed striking bases in Crimea, for instance. What do you think realistically is a good next few months for Ukraine?
I think that actually is, the key. I don't want to be dismissive or be less than positive about Ukraine. We all want Ukraine to do well. And we can talk about what does victory look like in inverted commas. But if they can regain territory on the ground, then, fantastic. But they have got to have that ability, as we were discussing earlier. But I think what will put pressure on Putin is the fact that people, as I say, people like our own Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, others in NATO and indeed the Americans are now beginning to say to Ukraine, you can use these weapon systems to strike deep into Russia. And therefore, weapon systems like the ATACMS, like air power, drones, and so on and so forth, giving them the ability to strike deep inside Russia, not just into Crimea, but deep into Russia. And why wouldn't we have allowed them to do that? At the end of the day, Ukraine has been hit hard, their infrastructure in particular, their energy infrastructure, and so on. So I think if giving them the ability to do that, and allowing them to do that is a very important message. And if they can begin to cause serious trouble deep inside Russia, then I think Putin may be, put in a position where he's having to scratch his head and think, we're not making progress on the ground. They have the ability to hit deeply, and we've got to somehow bring this thing to an end.
Do you think Russia's operational objective is in the northeast? I was reading some analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, and they were saying they believe Russia are trying to create a buffer zone in the northeast to try and limit Ukraine's ability to strike targets inside Russian territory, for example, Belgorod. And as a result, they think it's unlikely, although you obviously can't rule it out and you don't want to be complacent, that Russia will make a direct push for example, Kharkiv city. What's your reading of it?
Yeah, I understand that, and I don't think any of us, really knows what the outcome of this will be. But I've read too about this idea of a buffer zone, but actually it's not that big in terms of the ability for the Ukraine to strike deep into Russia with the new weapons that are coming, etc. I can't honestly believe it's going to make that much difference. I think securing territory undoubtedly is an aim of Russia, and they still haven't given up on the whole idea of taking over the whole of Ukraine, and not just chunks of it on the east or in the north. So I suspect this is, I would say, from a military point of view, this is a not unexpected offensive, trying to achieve maybe potentially a breakthrough to push through the Ukrainian defensive, and as things develop, you then seize your opportunity. And if the front line does give them the opportunity to press on and surround or secure, the city, then that's probably what they will do. I mean, if you are Russian, why would you not want to do that? What they want to see is Ukraine basically capitulate. And if this puts further pressure on Zelensky and the leadership in Ukraine, then I think that's what the Russians will continue to try to do.
Do you think the gains we're seeing Russia making in the northeast of Ukraine at the moment are a direct result of the delayed American military aid?
Well, I wouldn't just put the blame on the Americans. I think collectively, we, the West, have been, we've been providing a lot of equipment, clearly, and a lot of support. And I don't want to diminish that. But nonetheless, all that we've given them as the months have gone by since the invasion is the ability to basically try to hold the line, to defend themselves. That has been a gap in the last few months. It has had an impact. There's no doubt about it. The American delay on providing the ammunition and equipment that they're now beginning to provide, and indeed other nations too, have been slow in delivering aid and material that they've promised, undoubtedly has given a window, as I said earlier, a window of opportunity to Russia. So I don't think there's any doubt that it is linked to that. Now, it also has to be said that Russia itself, when you're fighting these campaigns, you reach, in military parlance, what they call a culminating point, where you've pressed on, you've done all you can do, and you're taking casualties, and your logistics are stretched, and all sorts of other things, and you just have to pause. You have to sort of pull in your skirts, get things sorted, redesignate and reframe everything that's going on, and then press on again. And I think Russia has been at a culminating point for a while. They've now put in all sorts of measures to enable them to conduct this offensive. So it's linked to the American issue and the rest of the West issue, but I don't think it's entirely as a result of that. But it's not a surprise.
And it's interesting that we're speaking today when Secretary of State Antony Blinken is making a surprise visit to Kyiv. We understand, according to US officials, that artillery, attacker missiles and air defense interceptors that were included in that recent aid package are already reaching Ukrainian forces. But do you think it is feasible that the tempo of deliveries can be increased?
Well, I was listening to earlier on to some of this conversation, and indeed with our defense secretary. And I don't want to be unfair, but you've got to separate out the political comments. And so yes, I'm sure nobody's lying. At the end of the day, some equipment will be arriving, but the issue is how much and how quickly, and how can they push on with the momentum to make sure they deliver what is necessary to first of all, of course, defend the turf that they're now defending, but then also to prepare them for their own offensive. This is a lot of equipment. But it's, the Americans are a big organization. They've got the sea lift and the airlift to deliver this stuff, but it will take a while. I don't think the scale of what we're talking about here, I don't think, to my mind, we're talking weeks, if not a couple of months before the sufficient combat power has been delivered to enable Ukraine to really be able to conduct offensive operations for themselves. So they've got to hold out. So what we're seeing arrive will be, no doubt, will be rushed to the front, and in particular the artillery ammunition and the air defences and the ATACMS and so forth will be very important. I don't want to diminish that, but the size and scale and timelines associated with that, I think we shouldn't be too optimistic. I think it will take a while before it really begins to make a difference.
I suppose one of the other questions is what more can the Americans do? It's interesting that the Biden administration says it's working on a new $33 billion package in which yachts, mansions, and artworks belonging to Russian oligarchs would be seized and sold to fund military and humanitarian aid for Ukraine. I suppose it does beg the question, though, why has this not happened before now?
Yeah, well, I mean, it relates to the whole of the sanctions business, doesn't it? And I don't think sanctions have worked, really. I don't have a problem with it. I don't have a problem with targeting individuals, but the scale and the ability to do that and really, generate sufficient resources to make a big difference, I'm not convinced is a big issue. I think the real issue for me is not just about equipment and material logistics. I mean, clearly, I come from a background of logistics, and logistics is undoubtedly the key to this. It's the ability of your weapon production, and Russia has ramped up their weapon production, significantly, and now spending probably 6%, something like that, of their GDP and so on. They have moved to a war footing. The West has been very slow in doing that. But it's not just that. If you want to conduct serious counteroffensives, you need to have the commanders and the in-place ability to bring together an all-arms battle. You need to bring together your infantry and armor and artillery and your engineering support and your communications and the other aspects of logistics and so forth to enable you to conduct operational level campaigns.
We were with a border guard unit, so not regular army, but a special forces unit of the border guard. And the commander of that border guard unit, they're actually called the Peaky Blinders. He is a Lyptsi native, so he knows every inch of this terrain. He cycled all these roads, all the dirt tracks as a child, so he knows exactly where to find the Russians, where they'll be, where to look for them. And so he was a pretty good guide, I thought, to take us there.
And how close did you get to the Russian forces?
So while we were in the foxhole, we heard automatic weapons fire open up about a mile and a half to our right, which then sent this team looking for the Russians. They got a drone up in the air and they were hunting to try and find where the fire was coming from. On the drone, we were able to watch 3 Ukrainian soldiers engaging a platoon of Russian infantry. And the drone team were then able to send their first-person view drones out to attack the Russians, break up the attack, and then pursue them through the woods as they tried to run away.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot, and we are joined this time from Ukraine by Maxim Tucker, an editor on the Times' foreign desk, who was in Kyiv and Kyiv correspondent between 2014 and 2016. Maxim has returned to report from the front line since 2022, and he's speaking to us now from Kharkiv. Maxim, thank you very much for your time. We are talking days into a Russian probing incursion into the Kharkiv Oblast from Russia. How are things where you are in Kharkiv city?
So Kharkiv city is under very heavy bombardment. It's been intensified since the offensive started on Friday. There are glide bombs coming in from Russian jets, and there are cruise missiles hitting the city every single night, even into the afternoon sometimes. So there's a very heavy bombardment of Kharkiv city itself. But the Russians are still not within artillery range, and that's one of the concerns that is here in Kharkiv city, is that if the Russians can win the battle for Lyptsi, which is a very ferocious battle being fought in a village outside Kharkiv now, they will be able to bring their barrel artillery into range of the city centre.
You've been outside the city. Can you tell me, Lyptsi is one of the places you have been to, isn't it? Can you tell us where else you've been, where you've been, exactly what you've been seeing?
So we were in Lyptsi yesterday in a foxhole with the Ukrainian Special Forces team. It's incredibly loud there. There is incoming and outgoing fire all day, mortars, large caliber artillery, Russian jets dropping glide bombs on Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian helicopters responding by firing rockets at Russian positions. It's a really, really intense 21st century battle. And then you also have these drone operators who are hunting for each other's positions in the foliage and dropping grenades or launching first-person view drones to try and attack infantry on the move that are exposed.
How did you get to Lyptsi, and can you tell me a bit about your journey to get to Kharkiv Oblast?
So the journey from Kiev is quite straightforward to Kharkiv. It's a 6-hour drive. And then it's really a case of persuading a unit to take you with them into the regional areas where the fighting is. There has been a moratorium placed on journalists by the regular army, so you have to kind of look for different units that might accept you. And we were in touch with a special forces team that I know through another contact, and because there's a personal relationship there, they said, okay, we'll take you and show you how we work. And they took us a little bit further than I thought we were going to go into Lyptsi, but it was a very interesting experience, and we saw firsthand how heavy the fighting is and the kind of work that they are doing, the way that they fight with drones to track Russians and to see the Russian infantry is encroaching across the fields, and then how the Russians are trying to use small groups to kind of get behind Ukrainian forces. This is a new tactic for the Russians. They usually advance in big armoured columns, but they've decided to use small groups to try and infiltrate Ukrainian positions using foliage and the advantage in the Kharkiv region that there's a lot of trees, a lot of fields with undergrowth and a lot of rivers with valleys that they can hide in.
You told me you were in a foxhole in Lyptsi. Can you just tell me a bit more about it? What was it like? How many people were with you, and what were the conditions like?
So the team is about 8 people, but they are travelling to those positions during the day, flying drone missions, dropping munitions on the Russians, calling in artillery strikes and hunting for Russians in the area. We were with a border guard unit, so not regular army, but a special forces unit of the border guard. And the commander of that border guard unit, they're actually called the Peaky Blinders. He is a Lyptsi native, so he knows every inch of this terrain. He cycled all these roads, all the dirt tracks as a child, so he knows exactly where to find the Russians, where they'll be, where to look for them. And so he was a pretty good guide, I thought, to take us there.
And how close did you get to the Russian forces?
So while we were in the foxhole, we heard automatic weapons fire open up about a mile and a half to our right, which then sent this team looking for the Russians. They got a drone up in the air and they were hunting to try and find where the fire was coming from. On the drone, we were able to watch 3 Ukrainian soldiers engaging a platoon of Russian infantry. And the drone team were then able to send their first-person view drones out to attack the Russians, break up the attack, and then pursue them through the woods as they tried to run away.
And do you know whether the Ukrainian forces have actually managed to take any prisoners of war?
Well, the forces we were with haven't said anything about that. They haven't discussed that. We know that the Russians have taken some prisoners from the Kraken unit, a special forces unit that had been sent in to help bolster the line. I think the Ukraine is mostly fighting a rearguard action and trying to stabilize its front line. There are counterattacks, but I don't think that they're focused on taking prisoners of war as far as I can see.
So the situation in Lyptsi at the moment is the fact that it's not been taken by the Russians yet, but that the Ukrainians are heavily defending. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it's a really key place, because if the Russians can get to the heights in Lyptsi, then they can bring their artillery into range of Kharkiv. And that will make the situation very difficult for the command structure and for the 1.5 million people that used to call Kharkiv home. Many of them have already left, but people will be looking to go back.
So that was yesterday. Where else have you been, and how did it compare?
So previously we were in Vovchansk. We joined a police mission to evacuate civilians. It's a different kind of battle, because they're attacking the city just indiscriminately. The Russians are shelling all the houses in the town. It's a town of 18,000 people, whereas yesterday we were in a foxhole in a tree line, basically in a set of fields. So it's a different kind of warfare. I think the Ukrainians are having a very hard time there, because the Russians are already into the outskirts of the town. They've already taken some houses and are fighting through, and the Ukrainians are seeking to drive them back. But the thing is, Vovchansk is only 3 miles from the Russian border, so it's very easy for the Russians to attack the Ukrainians there across the border, fly their jets and nearby, dropping glide bombs. And the Ukrainians are struggling because there is this prohibition from the West on using weapons like ATACMS, which could be used to hit Russian points where they can command and control points or ammunition dumps and supplies, logistical lines into Kharkiv. But they can't do that because the US has said they're not allowed to.
You have written about people being evacuated from Vovchansk. Can you tell us a bit more about how many people have gone and how difficult that has been?
Well, I think the town was of 18,000 people. A lot of them left during the first occupation in 2022. And I think a lot of people have left of their own accord again for a second time since then. The police told us that they'd evacuated about 1,500 people. I think several hundred people, maybe thousands of people, have been evacuated by volunteers that have also come in to help the police. And the police told us there were only about 300 people left to evacuate. And that when we were with them, it was perhaps the last day that they would be doing it and be able to do it, because the police are evacuating these civilians largely without armoured patrol cars. So they're just driving very, very fast into addresses where they've received distress calls from, packing in these old ladies, predominantly old ladies who can't get out of the town, into their cars and driving them out as fast as they can.
I mean, you said predominantly old ladies. The populations of these villages and these areas, is it coming down to the older generations of people? Or what is the demographic at the moment from what you've seen?
So a lot of people have already left the villages of their own accord, and it's the people that struggle to both envisage a future somewhere else, but also struggle to physically leave and to carry their belongings that normally remain behind. And those are the people that the police have tried to get out. We interviewed one lady, Valentina, 79, who said her granddaughter was begging her to pack her bags, and she hadn't listened because she just wanted to stay there as her home. When we went to pick her up, and we actually ended up taking her in our car because the police car was full, she told us, "I know it's too late, I should have packed my bags, and now I only have this handbag, it's all I can take with me in this moment. But I just didn't want to leave, it's my home." And she doesn't know where she'll go, and she doesn't know what kind of future she'll have. So, these people are always weighing up what it looks like to leave versus what it looks like to stay. But when we got to her house, it was clear that there was incoming mortar fire in the area around her. The neighbouring house was burning, so she admitted it was well past time to leave.
And do you get the impression that there are many people, Ukrainians, who are now trapped in that village?
Well, I think the police have done a really good job, and volunteers have done a really good job of going in to get those people. So when they get a message of distress from someone who's stuck and wants to go out, they do go in and they risk their lives to go and get those people under very, very heavy shell fire. So people that want to get out have been told, this is your opportunity, this is how we do it, this is how you contact us, and they have tried to get them out. So I think it's only people who may not even have the ability to reach the police or tell them that they're stuck there who will be remaining there. So the most vulnerable, probably.
You were telling me just before about the frustration that people must feel that they're being attacked from Russia, and ATACMS are not allowed to use in the other direction. And I'm just wondering, having been there and also in the foxhole, what is the actual morale like of the soldiers that you've encountered? So
it's always a difficult one because the Special Forces units tend to have a much higher morale. They're very motivated. They understand why they're fighting. They take generally fewer casualties because they're tasked with special operations, and they're not just holding the line, sitting in a trench all the time. And infantry, generally when we've spoken to infantry, they're more tired, they're more exhausted, they're shell shocked, and they find it difficult because they need people to hold the line and they don't have enough people. So there's always a different motivating factor. Now, what's happened in Kharkiv is that the initial territorial defence and some of the infantry brigades who were tasked with holding this line and creating fortifications didn't do that particularly well, and Ukrainians had to rush in lots of different special forces units in order to bolster the line, and different assault brigades who are volunteers and very highly motivated. So when you go and speak to those people, they are very motivated, and the morale is good, and they're determined to push the Russians back, and they're happy actually that there are lots of special forces operators in the area, because that makes it feel like an important thing for them. But clearly the fighting is difficult and they are losing their comrades, so that will take a toll.
Because one of the theories is that this probing action was to divert and have Ukrainian forces redeployed to this area. Do you get a sense of which forces have been deployed and how many?
Well, I think that's not something they'd be willing to talk about because obviously they want to keep it very secret. But there is definitely a sense that special forces operators who might normally be tasked with support operations in places like Chasiv Yar or in Donbass or in the south are now being rushed into Kharkiv and not available for missions in other areas. I think most of the infantry brigades, the mechanized brigades, are not being suddenly withdrawn, but assault brigades who would be tasked with counteroffensive operations and special forces are moving to Kharkiv, that's for sure.
The Russian incursion, first of all, into the Kharkiv region of Ukraine. They seized a number of villages near the border with Russia, and Ukraine's military intelligence is saying this week, or has said, the situation is largely stabilized. How do you see it? Are these breaches that stop short of a breakthrough?
They're very interesting. They are a probe that should have been expected, but they came in an unexpected place and in an unexpected way, in that they came straight for Kharkiv, where the Russians were thrown out towards the end of 2022, as you may remember, and the Ukrainians congratulated themselves a lot about that, quite justifiably in some ways. What seems to have been so strange is how relatively unprotected this major city, it's at least the third largest strategically, it's in the top 5. It's quite close to the Russian border, and the Russians appear to have walked in. Surprise. Just to mention it, the one thing that the Russians learned how to do was to build the defensive lines, Dragon's Teeth, really big anti-tank defenses right across the front, which they did for over a year under General Surovki, who previously defended Aleppo. He fell from grace because he was Prigozhin's buddy, but he's back again now. You would have thought the Ukrainians would have learned how to build defensive lines. They should have done. They have done in certain parts. But we rather shockingly know that the Russian forces moved across the border with relative ease, and they've invested or taken 8 or 9 villages left and right in the Kharkiv pocket. So they can get within range, I think, quite easily of Kharkiv. Not entirely sure they want to take and hold it just yet. I don't think that this is the main effort, and we can wait for quite soon for another really main effort. It may not come here at all.
Robert, you said that this was expected, but not perhaps exactly where it happened. The head of Vovchank's military administration, one of the contested settlements, refutes the claims that on Sunday Russian troops simply walked over the border. What kind of defences does Ukraine have in that area?
They're there, but they're pretty thin. And I think that this is the whole story. We know that they have moved up about 4 battalion-size battle group tactical groups into the area to oppose the Russian advance. But the balance of numbers, as assessed last night, is about 12,500 Ukrainians against at least 30,000 plus of a Russian attacking force. So the Russians have got their ratios right, and they are employing the obvious tactic of trying to drag Ukrainian forces away from other sectors where they might attack. That's why I think we have to be very open-minded as to whether this is the main effort. But because they pulled him away from other defenses, this is part of the story, is that Russia's now really building up what the military love to talk about, mass. They've got 300,000 plus inside Ukraine. The Ukrainians are very thin and very exhausted. And interestingly, they're putting young people into the front line now. And it was part of the Zelensky approach, his strategy, his human strategy was to use veterans to call up young middle age, because he wanted a lot of the youth, the young graduates, to actually be there to keep the economy, to keep the society going, to keep the infrastructure going. I think this is a very decisive year, and I think we will have to come to really rough politics certainly by midsummer. I don't even think it's going to be the end of the summer. By that I mean July, August. they will have to find a way of engaging with the Russians on this, and it will be very interesting to see what the minimal demands of Putin are going to be.
Right now, Ukraine, as you say, outmanned, outgunned, but the quality of Russian forces isn't there to make huge advances. How long can Ukraine continue, do you think, to limit Russia to incremental advances by retreating just enough to spare its own forces?
Well, I think that they've got to have a plan. I mean, it sounds absolutely almost crass of me to say that. But one of the things that I think is striking, now reading the in-depth analysis of the Institute for the Study of War, which we all look at, The Economist, and then going even further, foreign policy, foreign affairs. These are the things in the public domain. And then you go to strategic conferences. It's all sea power in the UK at the moment, the future of the Royal Navy and maritime NATO. But there have been very interesting revelations there. I don't think the alliance got together and was not nearly rough enough with Zelensky, saying you're adroit as a political leader, you have got to have a strategy. You have got to say what you're prepared to put your main effort behind and what where you're weak. The weaknesses are glaring. Above all, we haven't got there yet, Kat. They're terribly weak in the air, and Russia has managed to establish local air dominance over the front line with things like standoff glide bombs, with drones. Their drone technology, their electronic warfare technology has improved no end. They have been on a big learning curve, which we have underestimated at our peril. But by the way, there's one danger which afflicts both sides. And it was very interesting talking to my colleague, Kim Sen-Gupta, who's managed to get out to Ukraine a lot. Alas, age and infirmity has restricted me. I wish I could go there. But corruption affects both sides. I think corruption was a very big part of the story of the removal of the defense minister, but it is very much afflicting the order of battle, even what you can get into the front line with the Ukrainian forces. Putin started with a maximalist ambition. He wanted to take out the big cities. He wanted to take out Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, Mykolaiv, the big Dokkan base, and virtually closed down industrial and agricultural product access to the Black Sea. He's still playing variations of that. He's playing the instrument. The trouble is, if you look at the body language, despite the removal of Shoigu, the shuffling at the top, the firing of 3 deputies at the defense ministry in Russia, Putin is looking unusually confident. They're putting out pictures from the Kremlin where he looks more relaxed than he's looked at in years about this. You just sense that he feels he's got the initiative now and he hasn't completely shown his hand.
So if he feels the initiative and he hasn't shown his hand, I mean, do you have any idea how long and how fast this particular offensive will be and how this fits into his strategy?
Well, I think we have to go to China for this, because the language that has been coming out from the summit between him and Xi Jinping has been very interesting. And Ukraine is being mentioned, and he's been thanked for his help. But the conversation is all diplomacy. And I think that he will strike a blow, probably, and then try and get some equivalent of the 2014-2015 Minsk agreements. Initially, he wants the Donbass. That's what he's really after. And he's moving quite successfully his forces out to it. As you say, there are minimal reserves inside Ukraine for the Russian forces. But the analysts who remarked on that haven't factored in enough the forces over the border on the western borders of Russia and in Belarus. So it is a very, very dynamic picture at the moment.
So to what extent do you think that President Putin is now preparing the ground for some kind of peace talks?
Depends what he wants and where he is. It was very interesting this week. Sorry, I said to you I wouldn't allude to this, but the naval conference, 75th anniversary naval conference of of NATO held in London did talk about Russia's maritime strategy. And this is fascinating. And it's very important to Putin's vision of Russia renewed as a global power. And he wants Russian recognition of Russia as a global maritime power. So what is he after? He wants to ensure and strengthen access to the Baltic, which is very worrying now that he's surrounded by the Baltic coastal partners, all but one are NATO now, and the Black Sea, but also the Arctic. He's going very much wider when he talks about renewed alliances, putting real strength behind the expanded BRICS. He really means it. And I don't think we're following this nearly assiduously enough. We're far too much consumed, partly because the West, Europe, the United States, UK, are obsessed with their own electoral cycle.
Okay, you said it's very interesting what's coming out of President Putin's visit to China to see Xi Jinping. Obviously, it's early stages in that visit, but there are statements coming out beforehand that they had said that they talked about the stabilizing relationship between two stabilizing forces in the world. First of all, what did you think when you heard that?
Well, it's part of a familiar story now. We do not accept the rules-based order, so-called, established by the West. The target, by the way, is going to be for soft power. Is going to be the UN. But I'm not saying this is all pussycat country and let's sit down and have a cup of tea and talk it out over a samovar. There is going to be hard power exploration with this. And this is where I think one of the most worrying things is where America feels itself at the moment. America, whoever is in charge in the White House, feels it cannot handle 3 hot war crises, 2 actual, 1 potential at the same time. And Europe and the European allies in NATO have got to step up to that. And I don't think this is being realized. The 3 crises, of course, are Ukraine, actual war, the horrendous possibilities, because it's so open-ended, of Gaza, Israel, and things are really ramping up in the South Pacific, particularly in the 2 island chains coming off China, Taiwan.
I wonder if I can get your assessments of what we've seen in the past week or so, because it seems to me we've gone from a situation quite quickly from a relative stalemate on the front line to some significant Russian gains. What's your reading of the situation, particularly in the northeast of Ukraine?
Yeah, so we're talking about obviously around Kharkiv and the basically the infiltration of there was a sort of like a no man's land there, really, where it was covered by view in terms of like satellite and intelligence assets, surveillance, but not really frontline troops like manning, positions right on the front line, but strong points held in reserve further back. And so the Russians were able to, using small groups of mainly infantry and some armor support, get through surprisingly a little bit. So suggested, and this could obviously be the case, where there were just not enough eyes on the area at the time. And some question marks about exactly what happened on there. Was there some corruption potentially or some money changing hands? Yeah, certainly Ukrainian commanders around the area were like, how did this all happen? It could just be general incompetence, so you can't rule that out in the military. But as an ex-military person. But so essentially, and then you come back to what are the goals of this? What's the intent? It's difficult to divine Russian intent, of course, but Vladimir Putin has frequently said he wants to create a buffer zone in that area to stop drone and missile attacks on Belgorod, because this is one of the areas where, you don't have a buffer zone like the Donbass. It's Ukraine straight into Russia across the border, and not this seized part of Ukraine in the Donbass, which Russia has to give it a bit of depth. So that's the intent as from the commander. And we've seen different chains of command moving around, some more forces being put up there. We think around 30 to 40,000 Russian forces. But not the best troops, and not having enough armor really for a major breakthrough that we think at the moment. And of course, if their idea is to create a buffer zone, they seize these villages in the area around that. They're attacking on multiple different axes and haven't gone so far that deep. And the idea behind it was probably like, okay, we'll create a buffer zone, we'll spread some panic, we'll draw off the Ukrainian reserve who are already stretched. The frontline troops are exhausted at this stage because they don't have enough of them, and potentially draw away their reserve from further south in the Donbass and Zaporizhia region. So it's got a number of different gains for Russia at this stage, and worth trying. And of course, there'll always be be prepared to, if the lines do collapse, well, then we can try and move some units through whatever we have, whether they have armor or not. So I think it's manifold, really, what's going on there. It's interesting to see the breaking news that they've pulled back from some of those border villages. I mean, they're not massively significant, let's be honest. If Vovchansk was to fall, it's significant because there's some roads behind it which lead to Kharkiv. But even then, we have to wait and see if Vovchansk would fall. But it's significant in this idea of Russia, really being able to open what looks like, and we can tell by some of the vehicles, if you remember the V and then the Z for the different fronts. Well, there's a new one which strangely enough looks like one of the old Nazi units, for example, but it's a square with a load of patterns through it to show that these are forces for another front. Now, could be deception or whatever, but it's certainly what the Russians are using.
And the buffer zone theory, I understand in theory, but in practice, how effective is that buffer zone? Because Ukraine has had success for years now at striking targets quite deep inside Russia, and with the provision of these new long-range ATACMS the US are sending, will it actually work, the buffer zone?
Yeah, not really on that. And drone range, think about it, 120 miles at least, and some of them, getting to Moscow. So I think it's more political. It's political and strategic. It's like, I've created a buffer zone all across my border with Ukraine. And what is it an eye on? How does this end? And what do I need? Yeah. And if Putin is thinking 6 months out, a year out, that kind of thing, and he's looking at what could actually happen and what does a peace look like? And I don't want a border at any point with Ukraine. I think that's it, essentially. So that's why you do it, and it's fairly low risk with some good potential outcomes for them. So,
and do you think if their objective is to create this buffer zone, do you think that means that Russia may stop short of going all the way to Kharkiv city if it can?
I think that's a suck it and see. It depends, because do you reinforce success? What do they have? So the general consensus here is like you look for a force composition to work out what is the intent. And from my limited, open source understanding, is one of the things that trusted people who look at this very closely that I would follow would say there's lacking any, at the moment, identified armor to do a major exploit. Yeah. The second point is the defensive form of warfare is in the ascendancy because of the ubiquitous intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, reconnaissance, digital space. It's very difficult to mass armor without being seen and then break through. So it's difficult. The only really way you can do it is if the forces collapse. Yeah, if the force you're attacking, the morale and cohesion just break, the communication break, and then you can just drive. But if they stay and fight and they buy some time for intelligence assets and surveillance assets to be brought onto the location, things are seen pretty easy. And most forces, especially armor, have to disperse. So, and of course, their combined effect is when they're together and use a mass for shock to break through. So you can see why it gets very difficult to mass and break through. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's much more difficult than, say, it was. Well, let's think, even in 2003 against Iraq, we saw mass armor drive through. Granted, Iraq didn't have great intelligence, but this change in technology means that even middle power nations like Russia can access it much cheaper.
I wanted to get your reaction, Patrick, to the breaking news we had just before we started recording, which is the President Zelensky says he has cancelled all forthcoming foreign visits. What is the significance of that?
Difficult to tell exactly. It looks like, as we're talking about it, it's these smaller villages around the on the border, which the Ukrainians have withdrawn from. What does it indicate? Really, probably that this is some form of crisis management, that they need to stabilize the front. My understanding as of last night around Vovchansk, not in these villages further out than Vovchansk onto the border, was that things were starting to stabilize because they'd moved more Ukrainian troops in. Now, Russia do have a foothold there. I mean, the kind of thing you'd probably do with Vovchansk if you were planning this is try to cut it off and go around it. Actually, you wouldn't go into it if you didn't have to. So that's my understanding of it at the moment. It's probably some form of crisis management. There might be politics about this. He doesn't need to be distracted. He needs to focus on the front, maybe. There's that. I mean, there's also the security element, because it's good to see Blinken get in there so soon after the removal of the colonel in charge of the presidential security. So it's good to have had a grip on that, because that was a high vote of confidence in that system. So there could be a security element too.
And probably symbolically significant as well, even though many might say, actually, Zelensky is possibly at his most effective when he's traveling the world drumming up support for Ukraine.
Yeah. Does it say, is internal foreign visits? Is that a distraction because I need to be hosting people? That was such a big entourage which would have come with Blinken and so much planning gone into it? Or is it, I'm not going anywhere? And both make sense if you've got a pressing issue on the front, and you need to deal with that. So I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see which it is exactly. But look, it certainly indicates that there's a sense that attention needs to be focused domestically and on the front at the moment, rather than drumming up support, as it were. I mean, the Blinken visit was interesting as well, because it was all about timelines and kit. And the Ukrainians are looking for the Patriot systems. Now, we think they've got somewhere between 3 and 5 in country at the moment. They're looking for another 7 more. I think Germany yesterday said they'll find one, which is great news. The US would be great if they gave them more. I think Blinken's of the opinion that they should. And then they were talking about timelines. How long does it take to get in? Where are they? The US, we know, has got, pre-positioned stocks of stuff in Germany. They could get them across. The Patriot systems can be moved by strategic airlift. So they can get them across fairly quickly. And I think that's the number one concern for the Ukrainians, because the Russians are starting to get into a bit of a groove with using their, first of all, hitting some of the Patriot, not the actual batteries, but some of the launchers themselves we've seen the last few months. They're, say, down in Zaporizhia, their air force is a bit more active. That means they're getting their electronic warfare bubble and their own air defense out to put a bubble. And this is what the Russians like to do. You put the bubble over the front line and further back, and then get your air in to support, and then you can keep going a bit more. So there's certainly the long-range air defense, which is the Patriot, is really important. Then there's the short-range air defense. Now, that can get in really quickly because they're Stinger missiles, etc., and man-pads. So, but that's pressing too. And then of course artillery, where the Ukrainians are outgunned, I don't know, 5 to 1-ish at the moment a day. Just the Russians are firing maybe 10,000 shells a day, the Ukrainians 2,000. Production in the US is ramping up. The Czechs have done well to source almost 500,000 on the open market and support. But it's coming from a low base, and the Ukrainians need more. So that is it's rising, but so is Russia rising too. It's put its economy 75% on a war footing, banging out the shells, pulling tanks out of storage and producing more. So, I mean, it's a contest of economies at the moment.
Is it bad news for Ukraine, though? Because a lot of people said that Shoigu was actually a pretty ineffective defense minister.
It could be bad news for defense, because if you have greater technocrats there and energizing the system, then that could be bad news. We think that the optimum means of production for Russia will sort of reach their zenith by sort of the end of this year, early 2025, if they can extend that, because they got some sort of guru who can do these sort of things and energize more parts of the military-industrial complex, then that could be bad news for Ukraine. It's also, of course, bad news that the sort of axis of evil between the CRINC nations, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, seems to be sort of in the ascendant as well. Worth noting, of course, that we think something like 3 million shells have been delivered from North Korea to Russia up to sort of the end of April. And it is that shell shortage, particularly, which has been one of the great weaknesses for Ukraine, the ammo starvation, which, for example, General Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, talked about in mid-April in his testimony to the House Armed Services Committee. And until the ammunition from the West ramps up, in fact, there's 4 A's we really need to talk about in terms of the Western support, which is air defence, artillery, ammunition in the round, and aircraft, then that is likely to go in General Cavoli's testimony from 5 to 1 from 5 to 1 to 10 to 1 in terms of the advantage which Russia enjoys. And, artillery is the Russian god of war. So that's not good news in the interim. So I think Russia are at the moment taking advantage of this lull from a Ukrainian side until particularly the American support starts arriving in great detail. Now, we know since the $61 billion was voted for, that the 3 packages have been allocated so far, the 3rd package this week of another $400 million to add to the 7.1 billion, I think, which was given before that. But like all these things, the central problem of logistic planning and therefore operational planning from a Ukrainian perspective involves the differential in lead time. Until you can get those things in theatre, you're going to be on the back foot. Now, that doesn't mean that things are completely written off from a Ukrainian perspective. And I think one of the things, again, which will be interesting to look at, particularly in what is happening at the moment in the Kharkiv Oblast and maybe to a limited extent in the Sumy Oblast, is can Russia increase its tempo of operations? Because what we've seen previously in this war is that after an initial shock or surprise, things regress to a norm, and the norm is what we call entropy in the military. That is, the advances have been at a glacial pace. Now, we used to talk about in the Cold War days a thing called the Operational Maneuver Group. That was the exploitation echelon which would break through a gap created by your initial maneuver forces. Then we might recall that at the start of this war, we talked about battalion tactical groups, BTGs, as the currency of the Russians. None of that really is in train anymore. The battalion tactical groups have been replaced by very loose groupings of soldiers. You might call them companies, battalions at some level, but the expertise and training of those units to do any sort of maneuver above a low level seems to be missing at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see if that maneuver can lead to breakthrough. I don't think it will at the moment, but can they up the norms which we've seen of how far a unit can move in a day, which, as I said, has been glacial in this war so far, mainly because of the transparency of the battlefield to all the sensors and satellite technology, drones, etc., which really do seem to have caveated the movement which both sides have been able to conduct on offensive operations.
Talk about Kharkiv now. Just give us the latest on what we understand has happened, particularly over recent days, because further gains have been made, it would seem, by the Russians.
Yeah, it seems that a significant number of villages have been taken, and people quote that 100 square miles might have been lost to Ukraine. Now, I think you always have to be slightly circumspect about what that means, because, for example, the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast are 4.4% of the territory of Ukraine. So 100 square miles in Kharkiv Oblast doesn't actually mean that much. But all these things, both in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv, are really what does it lead to? And I've often said that tactical battles are sequenced in support of operational objectives to fulfill strategic ends. Now, we still therefore need to look at the whole range of problems across the front line which face Ukraine. We still have near Bakhmut and Avdiivka the opening the way to the cities in Donetsk, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, with Chasiv Yar still threatened. That would be significant if that was taken. In Zaporizhia, we still have Robotyne, which is threatened. That would be significant if it were taken, because that would also roll back the gains of 2023 when Ukraine took it. So all these things play into what I think I said about 3 months ago, that the Russian proverb that the chicken pecks grain by grain seems to be evident at the moment. It is that eroding stalemate, but how do you redress the balance? It is the application of those new weapons again, which will do that in the same way that the losing slowly in June 22 was also overcome by the giving of HIMARS precision strike and those sort of assets at the time. So we're in a bit of a sort of yo-yo or a roller coaster, really, in the same way we were in 2022. So I think the next 3 months will be, in a way, similar to what we saw between June 22 and September 22. I don't think that the Russians will have the power to do a major offensive. That was always going to be slotted, we think, for June this year. But they're doing the best they can at the moment with the forces at their disposal before other assets are brought to bear for the Ukrainians. And that would make sense from their perspective, I think.
Is Ukraine suffering at the moment from the West's long-standing insistence that Western-supplied weapons cannot be used on military targets inside Russia? Now, I say the West, there has been some movement. The UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron has essentially said that Britain is now comfortable with Ukraine using British-supplied weapons how it sees fit. But broadly speaking, that still applies. Is that hurting Ukraine at the moment?
Yeah, it caveats the distance, of course, of your deep battle. And that 14% that I mentioned about the oil refineries would probably be a lot bigger if you had the maximum range of weapons. And of course, there are certain countries which haven't given their deep battle weapons, which would also particularly be useful to Ukraine. Here, for example, I'm thinking of the Germans with the Taurus system. Now, again, in terms of the Taurus, many people talk about ATACMS as being the sort of golden weapon which would destroy, for example, the Kerch Bridge. That's probably not the case in terms of the fusing warheads that go with that. When the time is ready, it would probably be a combination of Storm Shadow Scalp, the French Scalp equivalent, and Taurus if it were there, which would be the enabling weapons to take down the Kerch Bridge. It is not probably the ATACMS.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.